In the quiet aftermath of the First World War, as the world caught its breath from 4 years of global conflict, another disaster began to unfold, one that would eclipse even the war in its sheer human toll. It was not a bomb, nor a battle, nor a political crisis. It was something invisible, something silent. It came by breath and by touch, passed between friends, family, soldiers, and strangers alike. It was the influenza pandemic of 1918, later remembered as the Spanish flu. Tonight, we'll take a slow, gentle journey through the full story of this forgotten catastrophe. You'll learn not just what happened, but how it happened, where it began, why it spread so rapidly, and what the world did in response. We'll meet the doctors who fought a battle they could hardly understand, the families who mourned in silence, and the cities that shut down in fear. This story is filled with mystery, sorrow, and resilience. It's a tale of an enemy that could not be seen, and of a world that had to adapt overnight. Settle in, close your eyes if you'd like, and let yourself drift into a story from the not-so-distant past, when the world was struck by a wave of illness that changed everything. Let's begin. The year was 1918. The Great War was still raging across Europe. Soldiers were huddled in trenches, exhausted and bruised from years of combat. Nations were battered and weary, with millions dead and millions more wounded, displaced, or mourning. In this landscape of violence and chaos, something even more insidious began to take shape. Influenza had always been a seasonal visitor. Every year, it swept through populations, sickening many, and sometimes killing the old or the weak. But the strain that appeared in early 1918 was different. It was fast, aggressive, and unlike anything doctors had seen before. It's difficult to pinpoint exactly where the Spanish flu began. Despite its name, it likely did not originate in Spain. Many theories suggest it may have first appeared in the United States, perhaps in Haskell County, Kansas. There, in January 1918, a local physician named Dr. Loring Minor noticed something strange. Patients were becoming seriously ill with symptoms that were far more severe than those of ordinary flu. The illness spread quickly and violently, causing fever, chills, and intense fatigue. By March, the outbreak had reached Camp Funston, a major military base in Kansas. Soldiers, destined to be deployed to Europe, began falling ill in large numbers. The cramped, poorly ventilated conditions of military camps created a perfect environment for the virus to spread. The timing could not have been worse. The movement of troops during World War I provided an unprecedented mechanism for global disease transmission. Men, packed into trains, ships, and barracks, carried the virus across the United States, to the coasts, and eventually to Europe. By the spring of 1918, the virus had reached France, the United Kingdom, and the battlefields of the Western Front. It affected soldiers on both sides of the war, reducing their fighting capability and adding a new, invisible layer of tragedy to the already devastated landscape. Yet this first wave, though widespread, was not the deadliest. It was severe, yes, and it disrupted military operations and sickened thousands, but for the most part, it resembled a particularly bad flu season. By the early summer, it seemed to fade. The world took a breath. But the virus had not gone away. It was evolving. By the late summer of 1918, as people tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, a silent transformation was taking place within the virus. Influenza, like all viruses, is prone to mutation. Each person it infected provided an opportunity for the virus to evolve, to become faster, more deadly, more efficient. And somewhere in the world, perhaps in the trenches of northern France, or in a troop ship crossing the Atlantic, or in a hospital ward crowded with the sick, the virus changed. What emerged was no longer just an aggressive form of the flu. It had become a biological storm. This second wave of the influenza pandemic would strike the world with a force that stunned even the most seasoned physicians. It arrived quietly at first, almost without warning, but when it struck, the effects were devastating. One of the first signs that something had changed came in late August 1918. A ship carrying American troops arrived in the port of Brest, France. On board, dozens of soldiers were already ill. Within days, cases appeared in nearby camps. By early September, thousands of soldiers were sick. But unlike the spring wave, this new strain was killing the young and healthy, not the elderly or the infirm, as was typical of seasonal influenza. Reports from military doctors were disturbing. Patients developed a high fever and severe body aches. Then came the coughing, deep, painful, and unrelenting. In many cases, the lungs would fill with fluid, and the skin of the patients would turn a dark, bluish black from lack of oxygen. Some victims bled from their noses or ears. Many died within 24 to 48 hours of showing symptoms. Doctors were horrified. They had no tools to fight the virus. Antibiotics had not yet been discovered, so even bacterial pneumonia, a common secondary infection, was often fatal. Hospitals filled quickly. In some cities, schools, churches, and even private homes were converted into makeshift care centers. Then the virus jumped again, this time across continents. The arrival in the United States. On September 8, 1918, the second wave officially arrived on American soil. It struck Boston first, particularly the Navy's Commonwealth Pier and Camp Devens, a military installation near the city. Within days, hundreds of men were hospitalized. By the end of the month, over 14,000 cases were reported at the camp, and thousands were dead. Dr. Roy Grist, a physician stationed at Camp Devens, wrote a letter to a colleague describing the horrifying scenes. "The faces of the dead," he said, "turned a dusky blue, as though they had been suffocated. The morgue was overflowing. We ran out of coffins." From Boston, the virus spread like wildfire. Troop movements ensured that nearly every corner of the country would be touched. Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, none were spared. Philadelphia would soon become the epicenter of one of the worst outbreaks in the nation. On September 28, 1918, the city held a parade to promote war bonds. Despite warnings from local doctors, officials allowed the event to proceed. Over 200,000 people lined the streets, cheering and singing. Within 72 hours, every hospital bed in the city was filled. By the end of the week, over 4,500 Philadelphians had died. Entire families were wiped out. The city shut down in panic. Businesses closed, public gatherings were banned, and makeshift hospitals sprang up in school gyms and churches. The global explosion. The second wave did not stop in the United States. It swept through Canada, Mexico, and Central America, moving with terrifying speed. Then it crossed the Atlantic once again, embedding itself in the hearts of European cities already reeling from war. In the United Kingdom, it overwhelmed London. Trains and buses were halted. The London Underground became eerily quiet. Hospitals ran out of space and supplies. The flu did not respect wealth or status. Royals, nobles, and common labourers were all struck down alike. India, still under British colonial rule, was one of the worst hit regions in the world. Estimates suggest that nearly 18 million Indians may have died during the pandemic, as famine and poor sanitation exacerbated the virus's effects. Entire villages were wiped out. In some areas, bodies were left unburied because there were no survivors strong enough to perform the rites. In Africa, the disease spread along colonial trade routes and military lines. In cities like Lagos, Nairobi, and Cape Town, it overwhelmed fragile healthcare systems. Indigenous populations suffered disproportionately, as centuries of colonialism had already stripped them of adequate health infrastructure and protections. In Asia, Japan and China both reported devastating outbreaks. In China, the pandemic added another layer of suffering to a population already reeling from warlord conflict and political instability. Japan, with its growing industrial cities and port traffic, faced rapid transmission and severe mortality. Australia and New Zealand were temporarily spared thanks to strict maritime quarantines. But eventually, the flu would reach their shores too, just a few months later. Why was it so deadly? What made this second wave so lethal? Scientists have debated the question for over a century, and while some mysteries remain, several factors are understood today. First, the virus likely underwent a significant mutation between the first and second waves. This mutation increased its virulence, its ability to cause severe disease. The virus also triggered a massive overreaction by the immune system, known as a cytokine storm. In young, healthy adults, those with the strongest immune responses, this overreaction could be fatal. Second, the global movement of people due to World War I accelerated the spread in ways never seen before. Soldiers moved from continent to continent. Refugees and civilians displaced by war moved across borders. Ports, trains, and military camps became epicenters. Third, the lack of medical knowledge and resources severely hampered the response. The world had no flu vaccines, no antiviral medications. Antibiotics to treat secondary infections wouldn't be discovered for another decade. Most treatments consisted of bed rest, aspirin, alcohol rubs, and the faint hope of survival. Finally, public health messaging was inconsistent. In many countries, wartime censorship prevented newspapers from reporting the true extent of the disease. Governments feared that panic would hurt morale or war production. As a result, many people were caught off guard by the flu's severity. The name Spanish flu itself was a product of wartime propaganda. Spain, neutral during the war, had a free press that openly reported the disease's effects. When King Alfonso XIII of Spain fell ill, the world paid attention. Other nations, under wartime censorship, had suppressed their own reports, so the impression grew that Spain was the source, when in truth, it was simply the first to speak openly. Life. During the second wave. The second wave altered daily life in profound ways. In cities across the globe, normal routines were disrupted. Schools closed, theatres, bars, and churches were shuttered. Public gatherings were banned. People wore masks in public, some willingly, others under legal compulsion. In places like San Francisco, failure to wear a mask could result in fines or even jail time. Streetcars ran with windows open, even in cold weather. Signs were posted warning people to cover their coughs. Many stores posted signs reading, "No sneezing, no coughing." Doctors and nurses worked around the clock, often becoming infected themselves. In many areas, medical students, retired physicians, and even nuns were recruited to care for the sick. The psychological toll was immense. Death became a constant companion. Funerals were rushed or cancelled altogether. Cemeteries overflowed. Coffin shortages were common, and in some areas, mass graves were dug. For those who survived, The experience left lasting scars. Many people lost multiple family members. Children were orphaned. Entire communities grieved together, often in silence, because no one wanted to remember the fear. The world staggers. Fall 1918. By October 1918, the world was fully in the grip of the deadliest wave of the Spanish flu. Towns, cities, and entire nations were buckling under the strain. No region was spared. In every direction, the virus moved unchecked, on ships and railroads, through market towns and war-torn villages, inside palaces and tenements. The flu had become the dominant force shaping daily life across the globe. In the United States, the scale of devastation was staggering. Nearly every major city saw cases spike dramatically. In New York, hundreds died daily. In Pittsburgh, smoke from the steel mills was said to mix with the smell of death. In St. Louis, aggressive measures were put in place early. Schools closed, theaters were shuttered, and church gatherings were halted. As a result, the city fared far better than others. This early intervention would later be studied as a model of public health effectiveness. Philadelphia, by contrast, remained a chilling example of denial and delay. Just weeks after its catastrophic Liberty Loan Parade, its morgues were filled beyond capacity. Bodies lay in homes for days, sometimes a week or more, awaiting burial. Priests drove horse-drawn carts through. Neighborhoods, calling for the dead to be brought out for mass collection. Coffins were stacked like firewood. The death toll was so high, entire blocks appeared abandoned. In San Francisco, officials initially responded quickly. Masks became mandatory, streets emptied. But the success bred overconfidence. Restrictions were lifted too soon, and the flu returned. Citizens were furious at having to return to masks and curfews. Tensions flared between public health officials and a weary, frightened public. And yet, even as American cities floundered, it was rural communities that often suffered the most. Without large hospitals or doctors, remote towns in the Midwest, Appalachia, and the Great Plains were left to fend for themselves. Neighbors cared for each other the best they could. In some communities, half the population fell ill. The strong buried the weak. Then they too grew feverish. Europe in turmoil. In Europe, the second wave of the flu arrived just as World War I was reaching its dramatic, bloody conclusion. The trenches of the Western Front had always been ripe for disease. Mud, rats, open wounds, and close quarters. But now, with the mutated influenza strain spreading rapidly among troops, the battlefield itself became a reservoir of sickness. French, British, American, and German troops alike were debilitated. In some divisions, up to 75% of soldiers reported flu symptoms. Hospitals, already overwhelmed with war wounds, were soon overrun by influenza patients. Stretchers carrying soldiers with bullets and shrapnel now shared space with those convulsing in fever, coughing blood, or dying from pneumonia. The flu even reached the highest levels of command. German General Erich Ludendorff later blamed the influenza outbreak for weakening his troops so severely that Germany's final offensives failed. Some historians agree the pandemic may have hastened the end of World War I, sapping armies of their last reserves of strength. When the war ended on November 11, 1918, relief swept across Europe. But the celebrations were muted. Victory parades were scaled back or cancelled. In Paris, London, and Berlin, citizens still wore masks and avoided crowds. The flu had not finished its course. India's catastrophic toll. In India, the pandemic reached a nightmarish level. Between 10 and 18 million people are estimated to have died, more than in any other country. The virus entered through the port of Bombay, now Mumbai, and spread quickly along rail lines and rivers. India's dense population, poverty, and colonial infrastructure made it especially vulnerable. British colonial officials, more focused on maintaining control and resource extraction, were slow to act. Entire villages were depopulated. In the countryside, bodies lay unburied, decomposing in fields or along the sides of roads. Survivors recalled jackals and vultures feeding on corpses left unattended. In the cities, hospitals were overwhelmed and funeral pyres burned day and night. One young Indian, just 18 years old during the pandemic, saw the destruction firsthand. His name was Mohandas Gandhi. The flu would leave a lasting impression on him, helping shape his views on medicine, society, and the importance of local self-reliance. The pandemic's reach: Africa, Asia, South America. The flu swept through South America, carried by merchant ships, soldiers, and migrants. In Brazil, Argentina, and Chile, it spread rapidly through port cities and into the interior. Governments struggled to respond. Many countries lacked centralized public health systems. Quack remedies and folk cures proliferated, everything from garlic necklaces to burning sulfur in the streets. In Africa, the pandemic's toll was poorly documented, but deeply felt. In some regions, mortality may have reached 5 to 10% of the population. Traditional healers and colonial doctors alike were powerless against the virus. In many places, people simply resigned themselves to fate. The pandemic compounded the effects of famine, locusts, and conflict in places like Ethiopia and Sudan. In China, the pandemic exacerbated the chaos of the warlord era. While the death toll is unknown, estimates suggest millions were affected. Cities like Beijing and Shanghai were overwhelmed. In some areas, families locked themselves in their homes, hanging red paper charms on the doors to ward off spirits. Japan saw a major outbreak as well, despite early attempts to quarantine foreign arrivals. Schools closed. Factories slowed production. In some areas, entire police departments were infected. The virus even made its way to the remote islands of the Pacific and the Arctic. In some Inuit communities in Alaska, over 90% of the population died. In Western Samoa, over 1/5 of the population was wiped out in just 2 months. An outbreak introduced by a single infected ship. Strange symptoms and medical mysteries. This flu was unlike any other. It moved with shocking speed, killed the young and healthy, and often presented symptoms more akin to a hemorrhagic fever than typical influenza. Victims sometimes developed heliotrope cyanosis, a deep blue discoloration of the skin just hours before death. Others coughed so violently they tore abdominal muscles. In many cases, bacterial pneumonia followed, suffocating the lungs with thick, bloody fluid. Doctors were baffled. Some thought it might be plague. Others suspected typhoid or cholera. Bloodletting, oxygen tents, and mustard poultices were used in desperation. Folk remedies flourished: onions under the bed, whiskey gargles, and patent medicines laced with cocaine and morphine. The medical establishment was caught flat-footed. Germ theory was still relatively young. Viruses could not be seen with microscopes of the time, and the influenza virus itself wouldn't be isolated until 1933. Doctors were flying blind, and yet, amidst the chaos, a few key lessons were learned. Masking, social distancing, and the importance of public cooperation became clearer. Cities that implemented these measures quickly and consistently saw lower death rates. Personal stories. Behind every number was a name, a family, a life. In Denver, Colorado, newspapers printed daily death lists, a grim tally of lives lost. In New Orleans, a mother placed her 5 children in a bed together, all feverish, and prayed they would wake up. Only 2 did. In Paris, the American Red Cross opened emergency aid stations. In Rio de Janeiro, priests gave last rites to hundreds daily. In rural Australia, Aboriginal communities were devastated when the virus finally reached them. Poet William Butler Yeats nearly lost his wife to the flu. President Woodrow Wilson fell ill during the Versailles Peace Conference. Though he recovered, some historians speculate the illness altered his mental clarity during critical negotiations. Writers, artists, musicians, soldiers, farmers, and schoolchildren, no one was untouched. Diaries, letters, and memoirs from the time speak of confusion, fear, and overwhelming sorrow. And still, the world spun forward. The breaking point. By the end of October 1918, entire nations were reaching a breaking point, not only due to the war, but because of the death toll from the flu. The pandemic was no longer simply a health crisis. It was a societal collapse in slow motion. Workplaces shuttered. Newspapers published only sporadically as their staff fell ill. In many cities, the police force was decimated by illness, as were fire departments, postal services, and utility workers. Entire streets were silent. The hum of modern life paused. Churches struggled to bury the dead. Funeral homes posted signs reading, "No more services today." In Washington, D.C., the National Cathedral held multiple funerals a day. In cities where undertakers were overwhelmed, the dead were kept in homes, often in bedrooms, as grieving families waited days or even weeks for burial. The social toll was immense. Isolation became common. Families cared for sick relatives alone, locking themselves indoors and praying not to get sick themselves. In some towns, people stopped answering their doors. Letters and telegrams were the only connection to the outside world. And yet, in many places, silence gave way to community resilience. In Chicago, volunteers, many of them women, delivered food and medicine to the ill. In New York, the Visiting Nurse Association hired hundreds of new workers. Mutual aid became essential. Those who were well enough helped others. But the virus was still ahead of science. The medical community fights blindly. Doctors had few tools and fewer answers. There was no known cause, no treatment, and no cure. It was a flu, but a flu unlike any they'd ever seen. Some wondered if it was a new disease entirely. Hospitals experimented. Some doctors tried blood transfusions. Others administered quinine, commonly used for malaria. Some recommended aspirin, though in dangerously high doses that may have worsened outcomes in some patients. The US Surgeon General advised gargling salt water. Nothing seemed to work consistently. Medical journals began reporting the same chilling details: rapid onset, massive inflammation, cyanosis, bleeding and death, often within 24 hours. Patients collapsed in streets, in line for food, at work, at school. Many doctors and nurses caught the virus themselves. Their sacrifice was profound. Thousands died caring for others. With no antibiotics to fight bacterial pneumonia, once the lungs became infected, there was little hope. Some patients were put in tents, hoping fresh air and sunlight would help. Others were quarantined in schools and town halls, converted into makeshift wards. There was no vaccine. It would be another 15 years before the virus that caused influenza was even identified. The war ends, but the flu marches on. On November 11th, 1918, the guns of Europe finally fell silent. The Great War was over. Cities erupted in celebration. Crowds filled the streets. Bells rang. Flags waved. But the flu had not finished. In many places, the jubilant crowds became super-spreader events. Within days, new waves of cases emerged. In France, the relief of peace was darkened by new grief. In Germany, Soldiers returning from the front carried the virus back to their homes. Armistice celebrations, which should have marked the beginning of healing, instead became another chapter in the pandemic's spread. It was cruel timing. A world exhausted by war now faced the deadliest phase of a silent, invisible enemy. In the United States, the fall spike slowly began to wane by December. Cities began reopening, businesses returned. Schools cautiously welcomed students back, but the virus was not gone. It had simply paused. A third wave would come in early 1919. A third wave and lingering shadows. Though less deadly than the second, the third wave still killed hundreds of thousands. It swept through Australia, Eastern Europe, and parts of Asia. In some cities, it caused more deaths than the first wave. In others, it was a flicker compared to the storm that had already passed. President Wilson, attending the Versailles Peace Conference in Paris in April 1919, fell gravely ill with what is now believed to have been the Spanish flu. His behavior during the final days of negotiations reportedly changed. He was confused, weak, and passive. Some historians argue that this shift may have influenced the final shape of the treaty, with lasting consequences for the post-war world. In India, the third wave further devastated a population already in mourning. The colonial government's failure to respond adequately deepened public resentment that would later fuel the independence movement. In Japan, Korea, and China, the virus continued to move silently, claiming the poor and elderly. In some regions, records were incomplete. The dead were simply not counted. By the end of 1919, the flu began to recede. The world emerged, blinking and bruised, into a new decade. A toll beyond numbers estimates vary, but most scholars agree that the Spanish flu infected about 1/3 of the world's population, around 500 million people. It killed between 50 and 100 million, making it one of the deadliest events in human history. That's more than the Black Death, more than both world wars combined. The pandemic killed more people in 1 year than AIDS has in 4 decades. It shortened the average life expectancy in the US by 12 years. It orphaned millions. It wiped out entire communities. And yet, within a generation, it was largely forgotten. Why? Because it left no monuments, no victory, no villains or battlefields. It came in silence and left in silence. But its legacy was vast. It reshaped medicine. It sparked public health reforms. It changed how we understand disease, how we respond to crisis, how we think about the air we breathe. The 1918 pandemic taught us that our greatest threats are not always visible. Sometimes they ride the breath of a stranger. Sometimes they wait silently in a crowded room. And sometimes the world must stop to remember not just how many were lost, but how many endured. As 1919 unfolded, the world found itself suspended between 2 kinds of aftermaths, one from the war that had shaken continents, and the other from the virus that had quietly killed more than the war itself. Both catastrophes had left millions dead, economies fractured, and societies exhausted. But while the victors of World War I were hailed and paraded, those who had battled the pandemic, nurses, doctors, families, volunteers, received little fanfare. The world wanted to move on. But grief does not obey history's timeline. In city after city, families continued to bury their dead well into the new year. In Chicago, hospitals still treated patients from the third wave into March. In Delhi, the smoke from cremation pyres lingered on the horizon for weeks. In the Pacific Islands, stories circulated of entire villages that had ceased to exist. Children raised by grandparents left alone. Schools reopened, but some desks remained empty permanently. In rural communities, the grief was often magnified by isolation. Without radios or reliable mail, many people had no idea that the flu had swept the globe. They only knew what they saw: neighbors dying, entire households silenced, and the familiar rhythm of life suddenly disrupted. Some would not know for years that what had taken their loved ones was part of a worldwide pandemic. The wounded world. The war had already left Europe crippled. Cities in France and Belgium were flattened. Fields had become graveyards. Economies were wrecked. In this fragile landscape, the pandemic only deepened the scars. Rebuilding required not just physical labor, but emotional resilience. And yet, the global psyche had been deeply shaken. In France, veterans returned to homes where wives or children were gone. In Britain, the last of the war's wounded were being cared for while flu patients still crowded hospital corridors. In Germany, where revolution had followed defeat, the pandemic added further misery to an already suffering population. In the United States, soldiers returning home brought with them medals, stories, and in some cases, lingering symptoms of the flu. Public celebrations were subdued, colored by the knowledge that so many had died, not in battle, but in hospital beds or living rooms, coughing and gasping for air. The 1920s would come to be known as the Roaring Twenties, a decade of jazz and hedonism and economic boom. But that wild exuberance may have been, in part, a reaction to the trauma that preceded it, a kind of cultural exhalation after a prolonged collective gasp. Lingering health effects. While the flu pandemic receded from the headlines, it did not vanish from the bodies of those who had survived. Many people experienced long-term symptoms: chronic fatigue, heart problems, breathing issues, and neurological effects. Doctors began documenting unusual cases: patients who had survived the flu only to develop severe depression, anxiety, or sudden onset psychosis. Some described it as a mental fog, a state of malaise and memory loss that persisted for months or years. Others were left paralyzed or with tremors, conditions that may have been early observations of what we now call post-viral syndrome. One mysterious condition that gained attention during and after the pandemic was encephalitis lethargica, or sleepy sickness. First described in 1917, cases surged during and after the Spanish flu. Victims fell into a kind of living coma, trapped between wakefulness and sleep, sometimes for years. The link between the flu and this syndrome has never been definitively proven, but many researchers believe they are connected. In later decades, some survivors of the 1918 flu would continue to report heart irregularities, respiratory weakness, or unexplained immune disorders. The full impact of the virus may never be known because in many cases, the damage unfolded silently, long after the fever had passed. Public health awakens. Despite the suffering, the pandemic was a turning point in the history of global public health. Governments had seen firsthand how unprepared they were for a disease of such scale. Hospitals had crumbled under the pressure. Communication had broken down. Supplies were inadequate. After 1918, countries began investing in national health agencies. The US Public Health Service gained prominence, and in Europe, ministries of health were reorganized and expanded. Surveillance systems were proposed, designed to detect and report disease outbreaks more rapidly. Though these changes would take decades to fully form, the seeds were planted by the trauma of 1918. Medical schools changed as well. Greater emphasis was placed on virology, epidemiology, and sanitation. The foundations of modern pandemic response, quarantine, contact tracing, masking, were all shaped by the experience of Spanish flu. One critical realization was the power of early intervention. Cities that had implemented restrictions quickly, closing schools, banning public gatherings, encouraging masks, had lower death rates. These lessons, though often forgotten, would resurface a century later during the COVID-19 pandemic. Why it was forgotten? Perhaps the greatest mystery of the Spanish flu is not how it spread or why it was so deadly, but why it vanished from collective memory. It killed more people than any modern war. It reached every corner of the planet, and yet, by the time the 1920s were in full swing, it had faded from books, speeches, and even family stories. There are many reasons for this. One is timing. The flu came at the end of World War I, a conflict so enormous and traumatic that it dominated public consciousness. People were weary of death. They wanted joy, progress, and normalcy, not more mourning. Another reason was shame. Influenza was seen as a private disease, something that entered homes and bodies silently. It lacked the drama of war. There were no heroes or villains, no monuments to honor the dead, no parades for the nurses and gravediggers. In many cases, people simply chose to forget, to push the memories away and move forward. But silence is not the same as healing. Memory in the margins. Still, the pandemic left traces. If you know where to look. In the archives of small-town newspapers, you'll find the obituaries, the announcements, the letters to the editor begging for help or advice. In old medical journals, you'll see the desperate attempts to make sense of a disease no one could see. In graveyards, you'll find rows of headstones marked 1918, whole families lost in a single month. Writers and artists of the 1920s and 30s seldom wrote directly about the flu, but its shadow lingered. In Virginia Woolf's journals, in T.S. Eliot's haunted verse, in the quiet despair of the lost generation. One of the only books to truly capture the flu's horror was Pale Horse, Pale Rider by Catherine Ann Porter, a novella based on her own near-death experience with the disease. Her story is one of the few literary windows into that moment of collective fear. But for the most part, the pandemic lived only in the memories of those who had lived through it. Memories that would fade as the decades rolled on. Echoes across generations. As survivors aged, the memory of the Spanish flu grew quieter. Children who had lost parents were raised by uncles, aunts, or in orphanages. Some spoke of the pandemic in hushed tones, others not at all. Trauma found its place behind locked doors, in diaries, in the pauses of conversation. But the virus had left a mark on every society it touched. In many countries, the experience permanently altered public attitudes toward illness, death, and medicine. In Japan, community hygiene campaigns expanded. In China, the pandemic helped catalyze efforts to modernize medicine, blending Western and traditional practices. In the United States and Europe, hospitals began shifting toward the model of centralized care with state support. The world, slowly, had become more vigilant. And yet, in all the decades that followed, few efforts were made to study the pandemic in detail. Major histories of the 20th century often skipped it altogether. School books mentioned it in passing, if at all. Only in medical and epidemiological circles did it retain its proper weight. For many, the flu was remembered as part of a personal story. Grandparents who never quite recovered, a great uncle who died young, family photos with one sibling mysteriously missing. The legacy was quiet, scattered in pieces across generations. The virus revealed. It wasn't until the late 20th century that scientists began to fully understand the virus that had caused such devastation. In 1995, a team of researchers, led by Dr. Jeffrey Taubenberger at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, made a breakthrough. Using preserved tissue samples From soldiers who had died in 1918, they managed to recover fragments of viral RNA. Over several years, they pieced together the genome of the 1918 influenza virus, a subtype of H1N1. Further studies confirmed what many had suspected. The virus had avian origins. It had likely jumped from birds to humans, possibly through an intermediate host. Its unique genetic structure explained its virulence and its deadly tendency to trigger immune overreaction in young, healthy adults. In 2005, the full genome of the 1918 virus was published. This allowed virologists to study it in unprecedented detail using modern tools. While controversial, due to fears of bioterrorism or accidental release, this research provided vital insights into influenza evolution and pandemic preparedness. The ghost of 1918 had, at last, been named. The 21st century remembers. In 2009, the world faced another influenza pandemic, the H1N1 swine flu. Though far less deadly, it revived interest in 1918. Governments rushed to stockpile vaccines. Public health officials referenced the Spanish flu in briefings. Documentaries, books, and academic articles flourished. But it was the COVID-19 pandemic, beginning in 2019, that truly brought the lessons of 1918 back into global consciousness. Masking, social distancing, overwhelmed hospitals, and political division all echoed what had happened more than a century earlier. People began revisiting the archives, searching for wisdom from the past. Interest in the Spanish flu surged. Suddenly, a pandemic long forgotten by most was front and center again. Its photos circulated online, nurses in gauze masks, streetcars with no coughing signs, mass graves in Pennsylvania. And with that renewed attention came recognition. Recognition of the suffering, the heroism, and the scale of what had been endured and almost erased. What the pandemic taught us. The Spanish flu was more than a health crisis. It was a moment of reckoning, a test of humanity's resilience. It showed us how quickly civilization can be humbled by nature, how fear and kindness can live side by side, how isolation can coexist with solidarity. It taught us the importance of science, the danger of silence, and the value of every life. And perhaps most importantly, it reminded us that history, no matter how long buried, has a way of returning, not to haunt us, but to teach us, if we are willing to listen. The quiet legacy. In the decades that followed, the 1918 pandemic remained a kind of historical phantom, its impact profound, but its presence nearly invisible. It had reshaped the world in subtle, lasting ways, not through monuments or memorials, but through policy, medicine, and memory. It had changed how cities approached health. Many local governments created dedicated departments of public health in the years after 1918. Sanitation became a core municipal concern. Epidemiology, a field still in its infancy, gained traction in medical schools around the world. The experience of the pandemic had also shifted the public mindset. There was a greater trust in medical professionals, a stronger awareness of the need for hygiene and preventative care, and an increased expectation that governments should act swiftly in the face of health emergencies. And yet, the generation that lived through the pandemic rarely spoke of it. Some historians suggest this was because grief was too large, too communal, too formless. Others argue that without a clear narrative, no war to win, no enemy to defeat, the flu simply didn't fit into the heroic stories people preferred to tell. Still, its legacy endured in acts of compassion, in the vigilance of medical systems, and in the stories passed quietly through families. Closing the chapter. As we look back from a century's distance, the story of the Spanish flu emerges, not just as a tragedy, but as a deeply human experience, one of confusion, sacrifice, sorrow, and perseverance. It is a reminder of how fragile our lives can be and how interconnected, of how societies respond to crisis, and how individuals find strength in the face of fear. And it is a testament to the resilience of communities, the quiet bravery of caregivers, and the enduring importance of memory. Though often forgotten, the Spanish flu was a defining chapter of the 20th century. It touched more lives than any other event of its time. And now, at last, it is remembered, not just in numbers or headlines, but in story, in context, and in the voices of those who continue to tell it. This is the legacy of the Spanish flu. While the Spanish flu of 1918 killed tens of millions, its cultural footprint has remained oddly faint. Unlike the two world wars or the Great Depression, it inspired little art, few memorials, and only scattered attention in literature and film. For decades, it was treated more like a disturbing footnote than one of the greatest disasters in human history. But its influence, though subtle, was profound, woven into the evolution of modern science, medicine, public health, and even the way humanity conceives of illness and society. A vanishing from culture. Why did the Spanish flu leave so little cultural imprint? One reason, as many historians have noted, is timing. The pandemic hit during the final year of World War I and into the year of post-war recovery. The Great War provided a compelling narrative of conflict and resolution. The flu, in contrast, was invisible. It had no villain, no battlefields, and no heroes who could be easily glorified. It brought only grief, and in many cases, shame. Death from disease was considered private, even mundane, despite the pandemic's scope. Families often felt embarrassed by how helpless they had been. There was no clear triumph at the end of the flu, no armistice, no treaty, no surrender, only exhaustion. Artists, too, avoided the subject. While the war inspired poetry, novels, and paintings, the flu remained largely absent from galleries and pages. Virginia Woolf touched on it briefly in her writing. Catherine Ann Porter wrote a novella about her experience, but most avoided it. Perhaps it felt too raw, or perhaps, in a world desperate for progress, it was easier to forget. The pandemic's scientific awakening. Though it faded from cultural consciousness, the Spanish flu marked a pivotal moment in the advancement of science and medicine. Before 1918, the world's understanding of viruses was extremely limited. Bacteria had been identified and targeted with early treatments, but viruses were invisible to the microscopes of the time. Scientists knew that something smaller than a bacterium was causing influenza, but they couldn't see it, couldn't grow it in culture, and couldn't treat it. The devastation of the pandemic lit a fire under global medical research. Institutions began investing heavily in virology. The Rockefeller Institute, Pasteur Institute, and other laboratories launched massive research efforts. Though the actual influenza virus wouldn't be isolated until 1933, the pandemic had created the momentum necessary for its discovery. The field of epidemiology also grew rapidly. Researchers studied how the disease had spread from city to city, how public health measures had succeeded or failed, and what social factors contributed to mortality rates. Many of today's public health models, quarantine protocols, masking strategies, even vaccine testing practices, are rooted in data from the 1918 pandemic. The Spanish flu versus other pandemics. It is natural to compare the Spanish flu to other global outbreaks. The plague, HIV/AIDS, COVID-19. The Black Death of the 14th century killed a higher percentage of the world's population, perhaps as much as a third. But it was slower moving, taking years to travel across continents. The Spanish flu, in contrast, circled the globe in weeks. HIV/AIDS has killed over 35 million people since the early 1980s. Its impact on politics, sexuality, medicine, and stigma is profound. But it has remained, primarily, a long-term health crisis, chronic and deadly, but not sudden. COVID-19, emerging in 2019, brought the 1918 pandemic back into public conversation. While not as deadly in percentage terms, its global spread, social disruptions, and political divisions mirror the chaos of a century earlier. It reminded the world of what it means to face a threat that cannot be seen, how fear and solidarity collide. But the Spanish flu remains unique. No pandemic has ever caused so many deaths in such a short period of time, especially among the young and healthy. The structure of society under strain. What happens when every layer of society is under pressure? In 1918, hospitals were overwhelmed, but so were funeral homes, police departments, streetcar operators, newspaper publishers, and sanitation crews. The virus didn't just attack the body, it disrupted the infrastructure of modern life. With city services collapsing, local governments turned to volunteers. In New York, groups of social workers and clergy ran food programs for families too sick to shop. In San Francisco, medical students staffed emergency clinics. In London, school teachers were recruited to assist in hospitals. The line between formal and informal care blurred. Mothers cared for neighbors. Children tended to their siblings. In rural areas, entire towns worked together to survive, helping to bury the dead, feed the weak, and tend to the sick. The pandemic revealed both the fragility of civilization and its strength. The same structures that crumbled under the weight of illness also inspired acts of resilience, improvisation, and sacrifice. Religious and philosophical responses. Religious leaders were confronted with difficult choices during the pandemic. Many churches closed their doors, holding services in open air or ceasing altogether. In Catholic countries, priests delivered last rites through windows. In Protestant communities, pastors wrote letters of comfort to parishioners they could not visit. Some saw the flu as divine punishment, others as a test of faith. In many places, religious gatherings were sites of both solace and spread, bringing people together in their hour of need, but also facilitating further contagion. Philosophically, the pandemic forced societies to confront uncomfortable truths about mortality and meaning. The Enlightenment promise of rational progress, of humanity's mastery over nature, was shaken. Here was a reminder that something as small as a particle of protein could topple empires. Existentialist ideas gained traction. If life could be taken so swiftly, without warning or justice, what did it mean to live well? What mattered in the face of randomness? For many, these questions lingered long after the fever had broken. The birth of modern public health systems. Perhaps the most enduring impact of the 1918 pandemic was the transformation of how nations approached public health. Before the pandemic, health systems were often fragmented. Municipal governments managed local outbreaks, but there was little coordination, funding, or centralized oversight. After 1918, countries began to realize that diseases didn't respect borders, classes, or military strength. If one city failed to contain an outbreak, the entire nation could be at risk. If one ship carried the virus, an entire continent could suffer. In the 1920s and 30s, new national health agencies were established in dozens of countries. The League of Nations created a health organization, one of the precursors to the modern World Health Organization, WHO. These bodies began to standardize data collection, study international outbreaks, and prepare contingency plans for future epidemics. In the United States, the pandemic accelerated the rise of the US Public Health Service. In Britain, reforms laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the National Health Service. Around the world, governments started investing in infectious disease surveillance, laboratory capacity, and disease education. One of the biggest lessons was the importance of trust, where public health officials communicated clearly and transparently, communities cooperated. Where censorship, confusion, or conflicting advice reigned, people panicked or ignored safety rules entirely. These lessons would echo through future pandemics. The Spanish flu and the rise of preventative medicine. Until the early 20th century, much of medicine focused on treating illness after it appeared. The idea of preventing disease through sanitation, vaccines, or education was still gaining ground. The flu helped accelerate this shift. Post-1918, medical schools began teaching epidemiology as a core discipline. Governments launched campaigns to teach citizens about hygiene, nutrition, and early symptom recognition. Public health nurses became vital community figures, not just treating the sick, but educating the healthy. In time, these changes would reduce infant mortality, extend life expectancy, and save millions of lives. The pandemic also fueled interest in vaccine research. While a flu vaccine wouldn't be perfected until the 1940s, the urgency created by 1918 inspired new approaches to immunology, virology, and laboratory methods. Scientists knew they had to be faster next time. The lessons not learned. Despite these advances, the world repeatedly failed to apply the full lessons of 1918 in subsequent health crises. In 1957, another flu pandemic struck, this time from East Asia. Then again in 1968. Each time, governments were caught off guard, supplies were limited, communication was poor, public memory had faded. In the early years of the HIV/AIDS crisis, denial and stigma slowed response. By the time COVID-19 emerged in late 2019, many nations still struggled with the basics: clear communication, coordinated action, and equitable access to care. The Spanish flu had taught these lessons, but they were forgotten or ignored. Still, in every pandemic since, echoes of 1918 can be seen in the strategies that succeed, in the mistakes that recur, and in the stories we tell ourselves about disease, fear, and resilience. Remembering the pandemic in the 21st century. As the world faced the COVID-19 pandemic, people began searching for precedents. Historians, scientists, and journalists turned back to 1918, unearthing old photographs, letters, and public health posters. Suddenly, the forgotten flu was everywhere, in articles, documentaries, school lessons, and social media threads. This resurgence of interest created new awareness. People saw how their ancestors had worn masks, argued over closures, nursed the sick, and mourned alone. They saw themselves. New books were written, memorials were proposed, museums curated exhibitions. The veil of silence was finally lifting, and in that reflection, a new question emerged. How will we be remembered? Will we forget this crisis as our ancestors did? Or will we choose to preserve it, not in fear, but in hope that future generations will be wiser? Closing Part 5. The Spanish flu reshaped the world without reshaping its memory. It challenged the limits of science, the strength of societies, and the resilience of the human spirit. It arrived quietly, destroyed openly, and left invisibly. But in its wake, it left more than sorrow. It left knowledge. It left blueprints for future response. It left reminders of what matters when the world turns upside down. Not just hospitals and medicine, but compassion, honesty, and shared purpose. Now, more than a century later, we remember not just the flu itself, but the people who faced it. The mothers, doctors, students, and gravediggers. The ones who survived, the ones who cared, and the millions who were lost. And in remembering, we honor them. Stories from the margins. Global health cooperation begins. One often overlooked outcome of the 1918 pandemic was the realization that no country could fight pandemics alone. Although many governments initially responded in isolation, the virus proved itself a truly global problem, traveling from Kansas to Cape Town, from Paris to Peking in mere weeks. This sparked the early foundations of international health collaboration. In the 1920s, the League of Nations launched the Health Section, one of the world's first multinational public health efforts. It brought together scientists and policymakers to share data on outbreaks, standardize quarantine measures, and track disease across borders. Though limited in reach and power, it laid the groundwork for what would later become the World Health Organization in 1948. The Spanish flu had made one truth undeniable. In the face of a virus, we are one species with shared breath, shared vulnerability, and a shared future. The economics of a pandemic. Beyond the death toll, the economic impact of the Spanish flu was massive and remains underexplored in popular history. Factories closed, productivity plummeted. In the US, gross national product, GNP, dropped by 15%. Across Europe, already weakened by war, the disruption added to inflation, food shortages, and labor unrest. In India, where the British colonial economy relied heavily on trade and agriculture, the flu devastated rural labor. Fields went unharvested, trains ran empty, tax revenues plummeted. In Latin America, ports shut down, and governments imposed curfews and shipping restrictions. Yet surprisingly, many economies rebounded quickly. The 1920s saw a period of intense recovery, fueled by pent-up demand, new technologies, and a desire for distraction. For a brief time, consumption soared, cities grew, and the stock market boomed. But the trauma lingered beneath the surface. Some families never regained their financial footing. Others faced lifelong health costs. Entire industries, like insurance and healthcare, were reshaped by the crisis. The lesson is clear. Pandemics are not just health events. They are economic earthquakes, shaking every sector from industry to agriculture to education. A century later, the world looks back. In 2018, a century after the first wave, historians, scientists, and museums held events commemorating the Spanish flu. It was the first time the pandemic had been given widespread public recognition. Exhibitions featured medical equipment, newspaper clippings, and haunting photographs. Nurses in homemade masks, mass graves, handwritten death notices. Public lectures revisited the science and the suffering. Schools began including the flu in history curricula. Families shared their ancestors' flu stories on social media. It had taken 100 years, but the pandemic was finally being remembered, not just as a tragedy, but as a turning point in modern history. And just 2 years later, COVID-19 would make that remembrance feel urgent, vital, and eerily familiar. Why this story still matters. The Spanish flu is more than an old tragedy. It is a story about how humans respond to the unknown. It shows our fear, yes, but also our courage, our mistakes, but also our capacity to learn. It reminds us that silence doesn't protect us, and memory isn't just nostalgia, it's instruction. As we reflect on the millions who died and the millions more who lived with loss, we are invited not just to mourn, but to grow, to take their story and use it, not to scare, but to prepare, not to repeat history, but to rewrite its ending. This story still matters because we still face the same vulnerabilities. And because, like those who lived in 1918, we too must decide what kind of future we will build from the ashes of crisis. The final wave of the Spanish flu subsided in early 1920. As spring returned to the Northern Hemisphere, so did life, unevenly, uncertainly, but persistently. Shops reopened, schools welcomed children back, church bells rang for weddings instead of funerals. The grief remained, but it was gradually folded into daily life. Survivors emerged into a changed world. The global population had been reduced by tens of millions. Families were broken, communities scarred, and economies wounded. But beneath the surface, something else stirred. Renewal. Out of catastrophe came reform, resilience, and for some, rebirth. The rise of the Roaring Twenties. The decade that followed the pandemic became known, especially in the United States and parts of Europe, as the Roaring Twenties. It was an era of jazz, flappers, economic growth, and cultural revolution. Historians often portray the 1920s as a response to the trauma of World War I. But the pandemic also played a role. Having survived death on an unimaginable scale, people sought life in all its colors. They danced, drank, embraced modernity, and chased freedom. Silent grief gave way to loud celebration. Cities buzzed with energy. The Harlem Renaissance bloomed. Women gained new rights and visibility. New technologies, radio, film, automobiles, transformed how people lived and communicated. This wasn't just escapism, it was a reclamation of joy. Yet beneath the glitter, wounds remained. Those who had lost children, spouses, or parents carried invisible scars. Some drank heavily, others turned to religion or activism. Many simply buried the past, too tired to relive it, too traumatized to speak it aloud. Art, silence, and the flu. Even during the cultural explosion of the 1920s, the flu rarely appeared in literature or art. Writers like Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and Eliot, who lived through the pandemic, largely ignored it in their work. The silence is striking. Why did this tragedy, so vast, so deadly, fail to find expression? Some scholars believe it was too personal. The flu lacked the political drama of war or revolution. It was intimate, domestic, messy. It happened in bedrooms, kitchens, hospital wards. It was a kind of suffering that defied grand narrative. Others argue that the collective desire to move on was too strong. The world had already endured so much. To dwell on disease felt like surrendering to despair. Still, traces of the pandemic slipped into art, almost accidentally. The sense of fragility, the themes of isolation and dread, the fear of invisible forces, all found their way into modernist literature, abstract painting, and early cinema. The silence spoke volumes. urban life, and new normals. The flu also changed how cities functioned. Urban planners began to prioritize ventilation, light, and open space. Hospitals were redesigned. Schools were built with larger windows. Public restrooms and water fountains were upgraded for hygiene. Elevators, telephone booths, and other confined spaces were scrutinized. Spittoons vanished. Salons and cafes adopted better sanitation. City governments began health inspections in earnest, not just for restaurants, but for entire neighborhoods. In some cities, fresh air schools emerged, open-air classrooms designed to protect children from respiratory illness. Parks and green spaces became more important. Public health nurses became part of everyday municipal life. All of these changes, subtle and slow, helped cities become not only cleaner, but more humane. Policy and politics in a post-pandemic world. In the wake of the pandemic, governments recognized the importance of preparedness. Budgets for public health increased. Training for nurses and doctors expanded. Epidemic intelligence began to take form, albeit slowly. In the US, the 1920s saw the growth of state and local health departments. In the UK, the Ministry of Health gained new authority. In Germany, social medicine gained popularity, emphasizing the connection between economic security and health. But progress was not uniform. In many parts of the world, especially in colonized or impoverished regions, healthcare remained underfunded and fragmented. The pandemic exposed inequality. In too many places, it did not lead to reform. Nonetheless, the idea that health was a public good, something society should protect, fund, and prioritize, began to take root. Science transformed. The 1920s and 30s were a golden age of medical research. The trauma of the pandemic had lit a fire under the scientific community. Viruses became a central focus. The influenza virus was isolated in 1933, opening the door to vaccine development. New labs, journals, and research grants accelerated discovery. By the 1940s, flu vaccines were being tested and soon mass-produced. Antibiotics arrived in the 1930s and 40s, revolutionizing the treatment of bacterial pneumonia, which had been a major cause of death in 1918. The medical community gained new tools, new confidence, and new urgency. The pandemic had taught a painful lesson. Ignorance kills. Science had to move faster. And it did. The psychological aftermath. Long after the fevers faded, the psychological effects remained. Entire generations carried the weight of the flu, whether they spoke of it or not. Some survivors experienced what we now call PTSD. Others developed anxiety about cleanliness, disease, or death. In communities where entire families had vanished, survivors lived with survivors' guilt. Children who had witnessed their parents die often developed a deep mistrust of the world. Adolescents who had seen society collapse sometimes grew cynical or fiercely independent. But there were also those who became healers, social workers, reformers. For some, the flu became a call to action. The emotional toll of the pandemic shaped family dynamics, public behavior, and even national identity in subtle ways. Just as with war, the impact was generational. A new generation's outlook. As the 1920s advanced and the world settled into peacetime, a new generation came of age. One born in the shadow of war and pandemic, but determined to define itself by progress. These were the children who had been flu orphans, the teenagers who had watched death enter their homes, the young adults who had seen how fragile civilization could be. For many, these early traumas gave rise to a hunger for knowledge, advancement, and change. They became the doctors of the 1930s, the reformers of the New Deal era, the soldiers of World War II, and the scientists of the post-war boom. Many of the leaders who shaped the mid-20th century carried within them the memory of 1918, not always spoken, but deeply felt. The collective trauma became a silent instructor, whispering reminders that life was short, that systems must be strengthened, that the future must be prepared for the unthinkable. From an individual pain to collective memory. It would take decades for the Spanish flu to be fully acknowledged in historical scholarship. But on a personal level, families preserved its memory in stories, photographs, and silence. Some spoke often of those lost, others never mentioned it again. In immigrant communities, the pandemic was folded into the broader narrative of hardship, just one more test endured. In indigenous communities, where oral tradition was key, the flu became part of sacred memory, a tale of resilience and mourning. In many rural towns, local cemeteries held quiet testimony, rows of identical dates etched into stone. In urban centres, old buildings still bore scars, unused quarantine signs, abandoned wards, repurposed morgues. It wasn't until the late 20th and early 21st centuries that scholars began to stitch these fragments into a cohesive global history. What emerged was a tapestry of sorrow, perseverance, and overlooked heroism. The Spanish flu in today's health conversations. Today, the Spanish flu serves as a touchstone in debates over health policy, emergency preparedness, and social equity. It reminds us that pandemics are not just about disease. They are about communication, trust, and the systems we build, or fail to build, in peacetime. The COVID-19 crisis has made this lesson painfully clear. Echoes of 1918, mask mandates, overwhelmed hospitals, misinformation, resurfaced around the world. And with them came renewed attention to what history can teach. In fact, many of the strategies used to manage COVID-19 were first modeled during the 1918 pandemic: flattening the curve, social distancing, public messaging, staggered reopening. The mistakes repeated were often the same as well: delayed responses, politicized science, unequal access to care. In this sense, the Spanish flu is not just a ghost of the past. It is a mirror for the present and a compass for the future. Cultural reflection and modern storytelling. Finally, after a century of near silence, the Spanish flu has begun to claim its place in cultural memory. Books like The Great Influenza by John Barry have become bestsellers. Historical fiction has begun to explore the flu's emotional toll. Documentaries, podcasts, and museum exhibits now tell its story with clarity and care. Art, too, is catching up. Installations, performances, and literary works increasingly incorporate the pandemic as a central theme. It has become, at last, a subject worthy of reflection, not just for its death toll, but for what it reveals about human resilience. As more descendants uncover family stories from that era, a richer narrative emerges, one that is not just about illness, but about courage, love, ingenuity, and memory. The story of the Spanish flu is not only about a past that was forgotten, it is about a present that must remember. In each chapter of its long silence, there were always voices speaking, quiet, personal, persistent. Today, we are finally listening. What we do with those lessons, how we apply them, how we honor them, will shape not only how we respond to the next pandemic, but who we become as a global society. While the Spanish flu's official record is statistical, its human record lives. In stories, fragments passed down through families, preserved in diaries, tucked between the lines of old newspaper columns. In Ireland, stories were told of entire households silenced overnight. In South Africa, grandparents spoke of towns where every door bore a black ribbon, In the Philippines, elders remembered the Trancaso year, when the air felt heavy and the island winds carried whispers of the dead. In Alaska, native villages were especially hard hit. In some communities, over 90% of the population died. Children who survived were airlifted decades later to new settlements, their languages and traditions lost with their parents. In Western Samoa, nearly 8,500 people, about 22% of the population, perished after a New Zealand ship carried the virus to the islands. The event remains a point of historical trauma, shaping anti-colonial sentiment and health policy for generations. These were not just statistics. They were cultures interrupted, histories rewritten, legacies endangered. They were lives. The role of women. Women were the invisible engine behind the response to the pandemic. While male doctors made headlines, it was often women who carried the burden of care, especially in homes and underserved communities. In the absence of professional medical care, mothers, midwives, and nuns became frontline providers. They nursed the sick, buried the dead, and tended to orphans. Many contracted the virus and died themselves. Women's organizations sprang into action. In the United States, the Red Cross enlisted thousands of female volunteers. In Canada, women's institutes coordinated food drives and mask-making efforts. In India, female health workers, many poorly paid or unpaid, risked their lives moving between homes and villages. In a time when women could not vote in many countries, their efforts were often unacknowledged. But they were essential. The pandemic demonstrated the crucial role women played in public health, laying the groundwork for later reforms in nursing, education, and civic engagement. Children of the flu. Children were both victims and survivors. Many lost one or both parents. Schools closed for months. In some towns, playtime was banned. Games went silent. Birthdays passed without celebration. And yet, children adapted. In the quiet of their homes, they created new worlds. They read books. They helped with chores. They watched the adults struggle and absorbed the lessons of resilience. Some became flu orphans, raised by extended family or placed in institutions. Their stories are harder to trace, often lost in the records of overworked relief agencies. But many grew up carrying memories of that strange year, the year of masks, of whispers, of empty chairs at the dinner table. For some, it shaped a lifelong caution. For others, it sparked a desire to work in medicine, public service, or social reform. The pandemic for them was a shadow cast over childhood, one that shaped the adults they would become. Preparing for the next time. The 1918 pandemic ended, but its lessons are still being written. With every new outbreak, SARS, H1N1, Ebola, COVID-19, governments and scientists return to that earlier crisis, comparing timelines, tracing failures, and trying always to respond better. Its greatest legacy may be its relevance. It stands as a mirror, reflecting our strengths and weaknesses in the face of nature's oldest challenge. As we continue this journey, let us carry forward the memory of those who came before, not just as victims, but as people who loved, who fought, who healed, who endured. Their story is not just history. It is prophecy, reminder, and, perhaps, guide. The unfinished story. Even more than a century later, the story of the Spanish flu is still incomplete. Not because the facts are unknown, but because its impact continues to ripple, quietly, invisibly, through time. In our genes, traces of the 1918 virus may still linger. Some researchers believe that descendants of survivors carry small immunological advantages, or subtle vulnerabilities, passed down through generations. These are areas of active scientific investigation, linking the past to the cutting edge of genomic medicine. In our institutions, the lessons of 1918 shape emergency planning protocols, vaccine research funding, and even urban design. Architects, engineers, and policymakers cite the flu as precedent when proposing ventilation standards, hospital capacities, and pandemic-proof public spaces. And in our collective subconscious, the memory of the Spanish flu is being reawakened, not just by historians, but by every new wave of disease, every hospital that runs out of beds, every family that gathers around a sick loved one, remembering how fragile we all are. Honoring the unknown dead. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of the Spanish flu was how many died unnamed. In overcrowded hospitals, patients were recorded only by age, gender, and date of death. In remote regions, entire families perished without documentation. In some war zones, soldiers buried in mass graves were never linked to the pandemic at all. And yet, each one had a life, a story, a voice, a name whispered by someone who loved them. As we remember this global tragedy, part of our duty is to honor those countless silences. The people who were lost not just to illness, but to history itself. Some efforts have begun, memorials, digital archives, oral history projects, but much remains to be done. Remembering the Spanish flu is not just a tribute to the past, it is a promise to the future. A promise that no life, however quietly lived or quickly lost, will be forgotten again. The final lesson of 1918. If the Spanish flu teaches us anything, it is this: humanity is more connected than we often admit. A cough in one corner of the world can become a crisis in another. The air we breathe is shared, so is our vulnerability and our hope. The pandemic was a test, one we failed in some ways and rose to in others. It showed us how systems can crumble and how communities can carry on, how misinformation can spread faster than truth, and how compassion can move mountains. How pandemics do not create inequality, but expose it. And it reminded us of what matters most, each other. A whisper from the past. Tonight, as we drift through this story of shadow and survival, let the voices of 1918 reach you, not in fear, but in wisdom. Let them say, prepare, but do not panic. Care, even when it costs. Remember, even when the world forgets. Their story is now yours. Hold it gently, share it widely, let it guide you through whatever comes next. While much of the narrative surrounding the Spanish flu has centered on Europe and the United States, the pandemic was a truly global event. Its reach extended into every continent, every country, every culture. It respected no borders, no class distinctions, no ideology. To understand its full impact, we must explore how it moved through the world, not just through cities, but through deserts, mountains, islands, and rainforests. This is the story of how the Spanish flu reshaped the world, one region at a time. India, the forgotten catastrophe. India, under British colonial rule in 1918, experienced one of the deadliest national outbreaks in the world. It's estimated that between 12 and 18 million Indians died, roughly 5% of the population at the time. The monsoon had failed, causing famine conditions in some areas. People were already malnourished, making them more vulnerable to disease. The flu arrived with returning Indian soldiers from Europe. It spread quickly along the railways and river routes. In rural villages, entire communities were wiped out. In the crowded cities of Bombay and Calcutta, the cremation ghats and burial grounds overflowed. Bodies were dumped into rivers. Funeral pyres burned day and night. British colonial authorities responded slowly and inadequately. Their failure to manage the crisis helped fuel Indian resentment and intensified calls for independence. Mahatma Gandhi himself fell ill, though he recovered. The pandemic, historians now argue, was a political as well as humanitarian disaster, an unacknowledged driver of India's revolutionary awakening. Africa, uneven records, universal grief. In Africa, the pandemic struck with deadly precision, but left only scattered records. Colonial systems did little to track indigenous deaths, but oral histories and regional accounts paint a grim picture. In South Africa, the virus arrived via ships from Europe. Within weeks, it had reached even the remotest townships. African communities, already burdened by colonial segregation and poor healthcare, were devastated. Some towns reported mortality rates of over 10%. In Cape Town and Johannesburg, black residents were disproportionately affected, in part due to cramped living conditions and lack of access to doctors. In North Africa, French and British soldiers brought the virus to Algeria, Tunisia, and Egypt. In rural villages, Islamic religious leaders organized care for the sick and burial for the dead. In some areas, traditional healers and colonial doctors worked side by side. In West Africa, the spread followed trade routes. Along the coastlines of Ghana, Sierra Leone, and Nigeria, colonial port towns became flashpoints. Local communities adapted quickly, often combining spiritual practices with isolation techniques. While the West rarely recorded these efforts, they represented significant acts of resilience and self-reliance. East Asia, rising powers, quiet losses. In China, the pandemic arrived in waves, primarily through shipping routes and railway lines. The country was already reeling from political instability, with warlords vying for power and the Qing dynasty recently overthrown. The response was fragmented, but some provinces implemented quarantines and isolation practices. In Japan, public health systems were better developed. The government distributed masks and health bulletins. Still, between 300,000 and 400,000 Japanese died. The pandemic exposed vulnerabilities in rural healthcare, leading to reforms in the 1920s and 30s. In Korea, under Japanese occupation, the pandemic spread rapidly. Colonial authorities issued health advisories, but enforcement was inconsistent. Korean families relied heavily on community networks for support and care. China's death toll remains debated, but some estimates range into the millions. The flu contributed to growing momentum for modernization and medical reform, helping spark the founding of new medical colleges and public health campaigns. Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. Isolation was no shield. In Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines, then under Dutch, French, and American control, respectively, the flu spread through port cities and into rural interiors. Colonial governments responded with varying urgency, but healthcare for native populations was often minimal. In the Philippines, American missionaries and Filipino nurses played a critical role. The country had recently fought a war of independence against the US, and tensions ran high. Yet in many places, community health workers worked tirelessly, risking their lives to deliver medicine and comfort. The Pacific Islands, due to their isolation, might have been spared, but colonial contact ensured the virus reached even the most remote archipelagos. Western Samoa was hit especially hard. A New Zealand ship brought the virus in 1918, and within weeks, 22% of the population was dead. Villages were emptied. Cultural leaders perished. The grief transformed into political action, fueling resistance to colonial rule that would simmer for decades. American Samoa, in contrast, closed its borders. Under the leadership of Governor John Martin Poyer, the island successfully avoided any flu deaths. It stands as one of the few places in the world that kept the virus at bay. Latin America, the long shadow. In Latin America, the flu followed shipping lanes and railroads, striking cities before spreading to the countryside. In Brazil, Rio de Janeiro saw tens of thousands of deaths. The government declared martial law to enforce quarantines. Rumors spread that German U-boats had released poison into the air. Chaos ruled. At one point, the president himself fell ill. In Mexico, the pandemic arrived amidst revolution. The country was already unstable, and hospitals were underfunded. Despite the violence, communities organized quickly, using churches, schools, and town squares as makeshift clinics. Catholic nuns, curanderas, and local doctors became the front line. In Argentina and Chile, the middle class had growing access to medicine, but poorer populations suffered immensely. Newspapers ran daily death lists. Cemeteries overflowed. Still, these events helped push some governments to expand their public health systems in the years that followed. Russia and Eastern Europe. Pandemic in the midst of revolution. In 1918, Russia was in the throes of revolution and civil war. The collapse of the Romanov dynasty, the rise of the Bolsheviks, and the ensuing chaos made for a perfect storm. Infrastructure had crumbled. Railroads were dysfunctional. Communication lines were broken. When the flu struck, it struck hard and invisibly. Estimates suggest over 2 million Russians may have died, though reliable data is scarce. Medical personnel were in short supply. Hospitals had been repurposed for wartime casualties. Many citizens were left to fend for themselves in freezing cities and war-torn countryside. Still, some local Soviets managed to implement rudimentary public health measures: quarantines, community aid, information posters. These experiences would later influence Soviet public health doctrine, which emphasized mass mobilization and centralized response. In Ukraine, Poland, and the Baltic states, where borders were fluid and conflicts ongoing, the flu added another layer of suffering to regions already devastated by famine, displacement, and military occupation. In Eastern Europe, the virus didn't simply pass through. It left deep psychological scars. It became one more ghost among many. The Middle East, underreporting and religious response. The flu's passage through the Middle East remains poorly documented. Many regions were under Ottoman control until late 1918, then fell under British or French occupation. The war, the end of empire, and the Spanish flu all arrived together in a haze of suffering. In cities like Jerusalem, Damascus, and Baghdad, the pandemic followed the retreat of Ottoman troops and the arrival of Allied forces. Armies, hospitals, and prisons became major sites of transmission. Sanitation was minimal. Medical care was limited to small missionary hospitals and army field stations. Pilgrimage routes, particularly the Hajj to Mecca, played a complex role. While travel restrictions were eventually enforced, early waves of the flu likely spread via pilgrims and traders. In some cities, Islamic scholars debated whether the flu represented divine punishment or a natural test of faith. Communities relied heavily on traditional healers, spiritual leaders, and family caregivers. Despite poor documentation, the oral record is rich. In villages and towns, the pandemic became a reference point for future illness. It's not as bad as 18, elders would say, for decades. Indigenous peoples, catastrophic losses, quiet resistance. For many indigenous populations around the world, the Spanish flu was a cataclysm. Lacking immunity to European diseases and often marginalized from health services, they experienced some of the highest mortality rates of the pandemic. In Alaska and northern Canada, Inuit and First Nations communities were decimated. Whole villages disappeared. In some cases, the only survivors were orphans, airlifted or relocated to distant settlements. Their languages, traditions, and ancestral ties were nearly severed. In the American Southwest, Navajo, Hopi, and Pueblo communities suffered quietly. US health officials offered minimal support. Many tribes developed their own responses: isolation, camps, spiritual ceremonies, traditional medicine. These efforts saved lives, but were rarely acknowledged. In Australia, Aboriginal communities were devastated, especially in missions and settlements where disease spread rapidly. Government policies often worsened the crisis by imposing movement restrictions and withholding care. Yet in every case, stories of survival emerged. Community knowledge, oral history, and spiritual continuity helped many Indigenous peoples endure. These experiences remain foundational in their collective memory. Global mourning, a shared, silent grief. Despite differences in geography, culture, and governance, one thread ran through every region touched by the flu: mourning. Around the world, families faced the same rituals: closed coffins, hurried burials, grief without closure. Many died alone, in isolation. Funerals were forbidden or severely restricted. In Catholic countries, priests administered last rites through windows. In Muslim communities, bodies were buried quickly without the usual prayers and rites. In Hindu regions, the Ganges overflowed with the ashes of the lost. The inability to grieve publicly deepened the trauma. In many cultures, grief is a communal act: shared tears, food, prayer. The pandemic denied that. People were left to mourn in silence, behind closed doors, and often without answers. But even amid silence, mourning found expression in poetry, in songs, in the gaze of a parent who survived but lost a child, in the pauses of elders recounting history, in the quiet prayers whispered in homes across continents. The flu was a global tragedy, but also a global binding. Never before had so many people in so many places shared the same fear, the same hope, the same desperate desire for life to return. The Spanish flu was not only a test of societies, it was a crucible for medicine. The early 20th century was a transitional moment in healthcare. Antibiotics didn't exist, vaccines were rudimentary, and virology was still a frontier. As the pandemic surged across the globe, doctors, nurses, midwives, and volunteers faced an enemy they could barely understand, let alone control. This is the story of those who stood on the front lines, the medical workers who braved infection, exhaustion, and grief to care for the world. Doctors in the dark. In 1918, even the most advanced hospitals were largely unprepared for a pandemic of this scale. The germ theory of disease was accepted, but the virus itself had not yet been discovered. Many doctors believed the flu was caused by Haemophilus influenzae, Pfeiffer's bacillus, a bacterium that was sometimes found in flu victims' lungs, but wasn't the true culprit. Without accurate knowledge of the virus, treatment focused on symptoms. Physicians prescribed aspirin, quinine, morphine, and camphor. Some experimented with antiserums. Others tried bleeding and purging, outdated practices that sometimes did more harm than good. There were moments of brilliance and moments of desperation. Some doctors documented cases obsessively, seeking patterns. Others simply held hands as patients passed, powerless but present. One truth united them: they were overwhelmed. the nurses who carried the world. If doctors were commanders, nurses were the soldiers. They shouldered the daily, intimate burdens of care, bathing patients, changing bedding, feeding the weak, comforting the dying. Many worked in makeshift wards set up in schools, churches, or armories. In the US, the Red Cross mobilized thousands of nurses. In Canada and the UK, nursing associations sent volunteers to urban hotspots. In India, local women trained in traditional and Western techniques alike cared for flu victims in both homes and hospitals. Nurses often worked 16-hour days. Many fell ill themselves. Some died, but they remained. Their work, long undervalued, gained new visibility during the pandemic. Newspapers praised their courage. Communities relied on them. In many countries, the flu became a turning point in the professionalization and funding of nursing. They weren't just caregivers, they were the last human faces many patients saw. Midwives and folk healers, the forgotten line. In rural areas where no hospitals existed, the first line of defense was often the midwife or folk healer. These women, usually trained informally, combined practical care with spiritual comfort. They made herbal teas, provided compresses, whispered prayers. In parts of Mexico, curanderas worked day and night. In the Balkans, traditional healers used garlic, smoke, and sacred water. In parts of Africa and Southeast Asia, spiritual leaders organized community care teams, blending ancestral knowledge with improvised quarantine. Though their methods varied, their intent was the same: to bring comfort in chaos. Medical authorities often dismissed them, but communities knew better. For many families, these were the only sources of hope. Hospitals under siege. Hospitals in 1918 were not the antiseptic institutions we know today. Many lacked proper sanitation, supplies, or staff. When the flu hit, they were swamped within days. In Philadelphia, doctors reported that every available bed was full within a week. In New York, patients lined hallways and stairwells. In Chicago, morgues had to stack bodies in spare rooms. Makeshift hospitals appeared everywhere: gymnasiums, warehouses, even railway cars. Medical students were pressed into early service. Retired doctors returned. Volunteers were trained in hours. Still, it wasn't enough. Patients often died waiting for care. Some hospitals locked their gates. In the worst-hit areas, the sick were turned away with a blanket and a prayer. And yet, within that horror, there was heroism. Countless lives were saved by overworked, under-resourced staff who refused to give up. Military medicine, lessons from the front. The flu moved quickly through military camps. The close quarters, shared equipment, and constant travel made them ideal incubators. At Camp Devens in Massachusetts, over 10,000 soldiers fell ill in just a few days. Medical officers described blue-faced men gasping for air, lungs filled with blood and fluid. They called it the Purple Death. Doctors in the military documented everything. They wrote reports, compiled statistics, tested theories. These records would become invaluable to future researchers. In France, British and American medics worked side by side, treating both flu and war wounds. Many hospitals were simultaneously handling gas injuries, amputations, and influenza outbreaks. Out of this crucible came knowledge, but at a high cost. Tens of thousands of soldiers died not in battle, but in hospital beds. Experimental treatments and ethical dilemmas. Desperate for answers, doctors tried everything: vaccines made from bacteria, serums from recovered patients, and cocktails of drugs. Some worked, many didn't. there were ethical concerns even then. Patients were often subjected to untested treatments without consent. Placebo groups were rarely considered, but the chaos of the pandemic left little room for clinical purity. Some hospitals injected convalescent plasma from recovered patients into the newly sick, a technique now seen as a precursor to modern antibody therapy. Results were mixed. One thing became clear: medicine needed standards. The chaos of 1918 exposed the need for evidence-based protocols, clinical trials, and regulation. Out of tragedy came reform. The role of medical students and volunteers. With professional staff overwhelmed, a hidden army emerged: students and civilian volunteers. In cities like Boston, London, and Madrid, third and fourth year medical students were pulled into full-time service. Many had only studied theory, not yet seen a patient. Now they were expected to diagnose, treat, and comfort the dying. Some medical schools suspended coursework entirely, converting lecture halls into temporary wards. Students worked under supervision, or alone, treating dozens of patients per shift. They learned by necessity, and many paid with their health. Alongside them were volunteers of all kinds. Teachers turned caregivers, librarians turned stretcher bearers, clerks turned grave diggers. Entire neighborhoods formed relief committees. Community kitchens fed flu victims. Churches opened their basements as shelters. These volunteers were not trained, but they were vital. Their courage filled the gaps left by collapsing institutions. Medical innovation amid crisis. Although the Spanish flu predates most modern medical technologies, it nonetheless drove innovation. One area of progress was data. Doctors, hospitals, and governments began collecting illness statistics more systematically. Charts tracked waves of infection, mortality rates, age distributions. These early epidemiological efforts laid the groundwork for modern disease surveillance systems. Autopsies, when possible, provided vital clues. In military hospitals, pathologists examined lungs ravaged by both virus and secondary bacterial infections. These studies hinted at how influenza weakened the immune system, making the body vulnerable to deadly pneumonia. Although electron microscopes didn't exist yet, virologists began speculating that the flu was caused by something smaller than bacteria. This sparked new research into filterable agents, what we now call viruses. Within 15 years, this work would lead to the isolation of the influenza virus. In short, the 1918 pandemic pulled medicine forward, not by choice, but by necessity. Masks, public messaging, and public defiance. Across the world, authorities encouraged or demanded the use of face masks. Made of gauze, cotton, or muslin, these masks were worn by doctors, soldiers, street sweepers, and school children. Some cities made mask wearing compulsory. In San Francisco, failure to wear a mask could result in fines or jail. Police officers enforced mandates. Public service posters warned, wear a mask or go to jail. But compliance was mixed. Some citizens resisted, questioning the science or bristling at government control. In response, cities launched public information campaigns. Health officials held community lectures. Newspapers ran editorials. Children were taught hygiene rules in school. In retrospect, these efforts were a mixture of sound advice, misinformation, and propaganda. While masks likely reduced some transmission, they were often poorly made or used incorrectly. The real value was symbolic. They showed public participation in a shared effort. The parallels to modern pandemics are striking and sobering. Hospitals become modern institutions. The chaos of the Spanish flu catalyzed a transformation in hospital design and operation. Before 1918, hospitals were often seen as places for the poor, the dying, or those with nowhere else to go. After the pandemic, they began evolving into centers of science, professionalism, and community trust. Ventilation became a priority. So did sterilization, record keeping, and training. Hospitals expanded their capacity and revised protocols. Governments began funding them more reliably. The public began to see hospitals not as last resorts, but as essential infrastructure. The pandemic also elevated the role of nurses and medical administrators, demonstrating that healthcare required coordination as much as care. From the ashes of exhaustion came a more modern vision of medicine. The price paid by healthcare workers. The toll on medical personnel was immense. Thousands of doctors and nurses contracted the flu. Many died. Others returned to work while still weak, driven by duty and necessity. There were no vaccines, no ventilators, no antiviral medications, only care, hope, and human contact. Many were haunted by the helplessness they felt, watching patient after patient drown in their own lungs, with no tools to save them. Some burned out and left the profession. Others became more committed than ever. In personal letters and diaries, we read their grief. I cannot count the bodies I've seen this week. I wake up each morning wondering if I'll live to see another. I washed his face, and he died before I could say goodbye. They were not just caregivers. They were witnesses to history. A legacy of reform and respect. Out of all this came reform. Medical schools added public health courses. Nursing gained new stature. Hospitals redefined themselves. In some countries, the pandemic even helped pave the way for universal healthcare systems. The idea that health was a public good, not a luxury, began to take root. And something else shifted too: respect. The courage of medical workers during the Spanish flu became part of civic memory. Though not always publicly honored, they were remembered in family stories, hospital records, and quiet gratitude. It was not just the sick who suffered, it was also those who stayed by their side. When the final cases of the Spanish flu faded in early 1920, the world was left with more than mass graves and emptied cradles. It was left with a changed society, altered not by dramatic political upheaval or grand declarations, but by slow, invisible shifts that filtered into everyday life. While the pandemic itself quickly vanished from public discourse, its fingerprints remained, pressed deeply into the fabric of the 20th century. They existed in the new bureaucracies of public health, in the softened silences of families who had lost too much to speak aloud, in the unmarked graves and the altered urban spaces, in the quiet understanding that life was more fragile than previously imagined. The flu did not declare its revolution. It slipped it under the door, wrapped in sorrow and science alike. One of the most profound legacies of the Spanish flu was its influence on the way governments understood their responsibility toward their people. Prior to the pandemic, health was often seen as a private matter, a family burden, a moral issue, or something addressed only in cases of visible poverty. But when the virus swept through every class, every neighborhood, and every nation, it became clear that disease was not just an individual problem. It was a societal one. Governments that had been hesitant to interfere in personal health matters suddenly found themselves managing quarantine laws, directing hospital construction, and funding scientific research. The state's role began to expand, not always consistently, not always generously, but inexorably. The very concept of public health as a civic duty took root during and after the Spanish flu. Over time, this would evolve into modern systems of health insurance, disease surveillance, and emergency response. But it all began in those years of urgent improvisation and deep loss. Beyond governance, the pandemic reshaped the architecture of daily life. Cities, already in the midst of industrial expansion, began to reconsider how they housed their people. Urban planning took on a new emphasis on airflow, sanitation, and spacing. Apartment buildings incorporated more windows and ventilation shafts. Public parks were seen not just as luxuries, but as essential health resources, places where people could breathe freely, recover emotionally, and escape the crowded, contaminated air of tenement blocks. Schools were redesigned with large windows and airy classrooms. Hospitals were no longer relegated to the outskirts. They became central fixtures in civic life, symbols not of despair, but of preparedness and care. Even the design of furniture and clothing reflected new health consciousness. Fabrics that could be washed more easily, chairs spaced farther apart, public seating with smooth surfaces less likely to harbour germs. The world didn't only heal from the flu, it was rebuilt to guard against its return. Social behaviour also changed in subtle, enduring ways. During the pandemic, people had learned to avoid crowds, to turn away from strangers, to communicate from a distance. These instincts lingered long after the virus itself had faded. Handshakes were less frequent for a time. Public coughing became a social offence. In some places, families kept spare masks in drawers for years, just in case. The very language of illness began to evolve, with newspapers and public speakers adopting more clinical, respectful terms for suffering and death. The emotional vocabulary of grief became quieter, more internalized. In households that had lost children, a sense of guardedness replaced former exuberance. Parents held their surviving kids a little closer. Neighbors looked out for each other more, but often without words. It was as though the pandemic had reminded the world that connection was both vital and dangerous, a paradox that would echo through generations. Cultural memory, however, did not immediately match the pandemic's significance. Unlike the world wars that bookended it, the Spanish flu did not become a major theme in literature, film, or education, at least not until the 21st century. This absence is one of history's great silences. Scholars have debated why such a seismic event slipped so easily into forgetfulness. Some argue that the trauma was simply too intimate. Death from disease is not a glorious death. It lacks narrative structure. There are no medals for surviving influenza. Others suggest that the pandemic was overshadowed by war, whose soldiers and strategies offered clearer moral lines. Still others believe that the flu's very randomness, its disregard for borders, its refusal to be pinned down, made it harder to process. Whatever the reason, for much of the 20th century, the pandemic lived more in personal memory than in public commemoration. Grandfathers would mention it in passing. Grandmothers would pause at a name on a family tree. It lived on in the gaps, in the missing photographs, the empty chairs, the faded birth records that never led to long lives. Yet the Spanish flu shaped the 20th century in ways we are only beginning to understand. It influenced who survived to adulthood, who inherited property, who led governments and revolutions. It changed the face of families and the fates of nations. It nudged the world toward medical modernity, fostered international cooperation in health, and helped birth the institutions that would one day respond to HIV, SARS, Ebola, and COVID-19. It taught scientists humility. It taught leaders urgency. It taught everyday people that sometimes the most heroic act is not to fight, but to care, to endure, and to remember. Even now, as we look back more than a century later, the story of the Spanish flu invites reflection. It reminds us of our shared vulnerability, not as citizens of nations, but as members of a single, breathing species. It shows how grief can reshape a world just as powerfully as ambition. And it calls us, again and again, to the quiet discipline of empathy, to listen, to honor, and to never forget those who suffered, who served, who died, and who carried on. A century has passed since the Spanish flu circled the globe like a shadow drawn across the map of the world. In that time, nations have risen and fallen, new diseases have emerged, science has leapt forward, and memory has begun to return. The pandemic that once seemed lost to history is now understood not just as a medical event, but as a turning point. In the human story, one that shaped the 20th century from the inside out, not with fanfare or speeches, but with whispers, wounds, and a quiet resilience that lived on in every survivor. The legacy of the Spanish flu lives in our public health systems, in our city planning, in our collective consciousness, and in the way we now approach global crisis. It taught the modern world its first real lesson in epidemiology. It forced doctors to grapple with the limits of medicine and inspired generations of scientists to probe deeper into the mysteries of disease. It changed how governments viewed their role in protecting the health of their citizens. But perhaps more profoundly, it reshaped how individuals viewed each other, reminding us, painfully and intimately, that we are more alike than different, more connected than we sometimes care to admit. In the decades after the flu, many of the systems we now take for granted were born. The World Health Organization, national healthcare programs, universal vaccine protocols, and disease early warning systems all grew from seeds planted in the soil of 1918. And just as importantly, our culture grew a new language for loss. The flu changed how people wrote about death, how they mourned, how they remembered. Though largely absent from fiction for a time, its emotional fingerprints appeared in poetry, in music, in the way future tragedies were processed. It helped teach the world that not all catastrophes are visible. Some are lived in silence, in isolation, in bedrooms and hospital cots and closed-off hearts. Today, as we face new challenges, from climate change to global pandemics, we often return to 1918 for answers, not just technical ones, but emotional ones. How did people find hope in the face of such widespread despair? How did they keep going when so much had been lost? How did they rebuild? Not just homes and hospitals, but trust. These are the lessons that continue to matter. These are the questions that turn history from a record into a guide. In remembering the Spanish flu, we remember not just the deaths, but the living, the nurses who refused to rest, the teachers who became caregivers, the children who grew up too quickly, the writers who chronicled, the doctors who experimented, the neighbors who shared food and firewood and faith. We remember the ordinary acts of courage that, in aggregate, carried the world forward. And we recognize that we too are part of that continuum, that what we do in our own moment of crisis will ripple outward, just as theirs did. Let this story remain with you, not as a tale of despair, but as a testament to the human capacity to adapt, to persevere, and to remember. Let it settle over you like the close of a long day, heavy, but not hopeless. Let it whisper what history often forgets to say aloud, that healing takes time, that survival is a form of strength, and that every name matters. Thank you for spending this time immersed in the forgotten yet vital story of the Spanish flu. In remembering it, you honor more than the past. You prepare the present, and perhaps gently shape the future. Now, rest. Let the voices of those who lived and loved and endured carry you softly into sleep.